Imagine a bomber so fast and sleek, it looked more like a fighter, complete with a bubble canopy and swept wings that seemed to slice the sky. But this wasn't some imaginary experimental prototype. This was the Boeing B-47 Stratojet, America's first jet-powered strategic bomber, built not just to fly, but to deliver nuclear firepower at jet speeds. But here's the part that history often forgets. Despite being at the very heart of Cold War deterrence, flying with nukes on board during the most hair-trigger years of global tension, the B-47 has quietly faded from memory. Why? Because it was quickly overshadowed by its longer-lived sibling, the B-52 Stratofortress, which still flies to this day. Yet, to reduce the B-47 to a stepping stone or a footnote in history would be a massive mistake. You see, this wasn't just a one-mission warplane. During its service life, it evolved into an airborne Swiss Army knife. It was a reconnaissance platform, electronic warfare workhorse, weather research station tool, even a Cold War spy, sneaking into Soviet airspace in its RB-47 variant to scoop up intelligence that other assets couldn't reach. But here's what makes the Stratojet truly legendary. It didn't just serve a military mission, it shaped the future for all of aviation. Its swept-wing design, podded engines, and high-speed performance became the blueprint for virtually every jetliner that would follow. The Boeing 707, the 727, and even the airlines we fly today all owe a debt to the B-47's radical design. And yet, all this innovation, well, it came at a price. Because for all its futuristic brilliance, the B-47 was also one of the most dangerous aircraft the Air Force ever flew. So in this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the story of the mostly forgotten jet that changed aviation forever. Its creation, its service, and the true cost of a flying machine that was always one step ahead of its time, and sometimes one step too far. So grab your launch codes and strap in, because this is the Stratojet story. PilotPhotog.com. If you've ever looked out a terminal window or up in the sky and seen the familiar shape of a jetliner with a long cylindrical body, swept-back wings, and engines slung under pylons, you're looking at the ghost of the B-47. That design, which now defines global air travel, wasn't cooked up by an airline or born in a passenger aircraft sketchbook. It came straight from the Cold War's cutting edge. It came from a bomber. More specifically, the Boeing B-47 Stratojet, which was a radical departure from the straight-wing piston-powered behemoths of World War II and the B-36 that came before it. This sleek jet-powered bomber introduced innovations that would ripple across aviation for decades. A thin, high-aspect wing set at a 35-degree sweep. Jet engines slung under the wing with pylons. And to complete the design, a fighter-style cockpit perched atop its narrow fuselage. In short, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen at this scale. And it wasn't just looks. The B-47 could fly higher and faster than any bomber before it. Key attributes when your job was to punch through Soviet air defenses with a nuclear payload. It was a bold bet by the US Air Force, and it paid off, at least on paper. Because in practice, the B-47 was a handful, a dangerously unforgiving aircraft that demanded everything from its crews, and sometimes took their lives in return. The statistics are grim. Out of just over 2,000 B-47s built, 203 were lost in accidents, resulting in 464 crew fatalities. Now that's about 10% of the total fleet, not lost in combat, but in crashes, mechanical failures, and mid-air catastrophes. Now there's no way those losses would be tolerable today, but this was a very different era, and it gives a somber take on the term bleeding edge. In fact, Air Force crews gave this bomber a grim nickname, the Crew Killer. But here's the paradox. Despite its deadly reputation, the B-47 was irreplaceable. During the early Cold War, it formed the backbone of Strategic Air Command, or SAC, where it served as the primary delivery vehicle for America's nuclear arsenal. Day and night, Stratojets stood alert, ready to launch in minutes and fly deep into the Soviet Union if the order ever came. At one point, B-47s were launching 15 seconds apart from the same runway. More on that later. But its very presence was meant to send a message. We're ready. So how did this sleek marvel, the father of the jetliner, become one of the most dangerous aircraft in the Air Force inventory? Well, to answer that, we need to rewind to the moment America set its sights on a new kind of bomber, one that would usher in the jet age. Now, before we dive deeper into the details of the B-47, let's take a moment to appreciate what the designers were able to produce without computers. Fortunately, today, we have much more powerful tools at our disposal, including today's sponsor, Lovable. Lovable can help bring our love of aviation to life by creating apps, tools, or even web pages without needing to be a software engineer. Lovable was the fastest company to ever go from $1 million to $100 million in annual recurring revenue. And once you see it in action, you'll know why. Lovable lets you build apps and websites by simply chatting with the AI. No coding, no tech background, just your idea and a conversation. Let's say I want to build an airshow tracker app that lists upcoming events, shows performer lineups, and even lets you log the coolest aircraft you saw. I just type that into Lovable and it builds it for me. Want to add photo uploads, ratings, a map of past sightings? I just tell Lovable and it updates nearly instantly. You can try it for free using my code PilotPhotog at lovable.dev. For us aviation enthusiasts, that means your someday idea can turn into a working app in minutes. It's really like going from paper sketches to a fully functional cockpit overnight. Once again, try Lovable for free at lovable.dev using my code PilotPhotog to get 20% off your first Lovable plan. The link's in the description. So check it out and see what you can build. And now, back to what makes the B-47 so special. To understand the origin story of the B-47, we have to travel back to the mid-1940s, during a time when one thing was being made crystal clear. The rules of the skies were about to change, and it was going to be all about speed. Towards the end of World War II, the United States Army Air Forces, or USAAF, had crushed its enemies with piston-powered legends like the B-17 Flying Fortress and later the B-29 Superfortress. But those victories came in a world that was approaching its sunset, as jet fighters like Germany's Messerschmitt Me-262 tore through the air at blistering speeds. It became obvious that the days of slow, lumbering bombers were numbered. What good was a Flying Fortress or even Superfortress if they couldn't outrun or even keep up with the next generation of interceptors? So in 1943, with the future closing fast, the USAAF floated a radical idea: a new jet-powered reconnaissance bomber. By 1944, that idea became a formal request, calling for something almost unimaginable at the time. This new bomber would need to cruise at 550 miles per hour, fly at 45,000 feet, and travel 3,500 miles. To put that in perspective, those specs would still make for a respectable aircraft even today. The big names of American aviation, Boeing, North American, Convair, and Martin, answered the call. But what they offered were cautious designs, conservative ideas. Think of them as World War II bombers with a few jet engines slapped on. Aircraft like the Martin XB-48 didn't leap into the future, they kind of tiptoed. Even Boeing's early concepts, models 424 and 432, looked more like a jet-age B-29 than anything revolutionary. Engines that were buried in the fuselage created drag problems, and the straight-wing designs just couldn't unlock what jets were truly capable of. The entire effort was on track to be a high-speed dead end. Then came a moment that changed everything. In May of 1945, just as the smoke was clearing in Europe, a group of American engineers went digging through the ruins of Nazi Germany, searching for any advanced technology the Third Reich had been cooking up. Among them was George Scherer, Boeing's chief of technical staff. In a secret wind tunnel lab, he found the mother lode, a stack of wind tunnel data, confirming something that had only been theorized back home. Swept wings worked. They really worked. The German data was precise, detailed, and backed by testing the Allies simply hadn't done to that point. Standing in that lab, Scherer saw the writing on the wall. Boeing's straight-wing bomber was obsolete before it had even flown. He didn't hesitate. He fired off a blunt, now famous telegram to his design team in Seattle. Stop the bomber design. In one sentence, Boeing hit the brakes and turned hard toward the future. This was no minor tweak. This was a total pivot. A full-blown reset at the very moment competitors were doubling down on safe, familiar designs. Boeing made a bold bet, ditching years of work to pursue a radical new layout inspired by captured enemy science. But they didn't stop there. While other companies waited in line to use university wind tunnels, Boeing had invested in its own. That decision paid off in spades. With their private test facility, Boeing engineers could validate and refine the new swept-wing concept in record time, giving them a massive edge over the competition. So yes, the B-47's victory was born in blueprints, but it was won with boldness, speed, and an ability to adapt faster than anyone else. In a world shifting from propellers to pure jet power, Boeing didn't just keep up. Well, they leapt ahead. And in doing so, they didn't just build that bomber. They built the future. What rolled out of Boeing's hangars after that now legendary stop work telegram didn't look like anything the world had seen before. In fact, the B-47 looked like it had been pulled straight from the pages of a pulp sci-fi comic. Long, sleek, futuristic, and fast. But this wasn't just a case of form following function. This was a machine built around ideas so new, they forced engineers to solve problems no one had ever faced at this scale. Designing the B-47 wasn't about perfecting one radical breakthrough. It was about stacking dozens of them together, each one pushing the limits and creating new challenges that demanded equally bold solutions. The three pillars of jet age innovation. At the heart of the B-47's radical design were three core innovations. First, the 35-degree swept wing. It looked elegant, and it was, but more importantly, it was fast. By sweeping the wings back, engineers essentially fooled the airflow into thinking the plane was flying slower than it actually was, delaying the formation of shockwaves that would otherwise cripple performance near the speed of sound. To reduce drag, the wings were also razor thin and shockingly flexible. So much so that the tips could flex up to 17.5 feet during flight. Like many design choices, that flexibility was both an advantage and a problem, which we'll get to in a moment. Second, the B-47 used pod-mounted engines. In the form of 6 General Electric J-47 turbojets, hanging in streamlined nacelles beneath the wings. By the way, the J-47 is the same engine that was used in the F-86 Sabre. So in some ways, you can imagine the power of 6 F-86s pushing the Stratojet along. The design decision to mount the engines in pods was pure genius. It gave the wings a clean aerodynamic profile, reduced fire risk by keeping the hot engines away from the fuselage and fuel tanks, and it made maintenance far easier, as you could remove an entire engine without having to get into the wing. But it did even more. Remember those flexing thin wings? Well, the weight of the engines under the wing acted like counterweights, suppressing the wing flutter and helping stabilize those famously bendy wings. And third, a bizarre looking but brilliant bicycle landing gear system. Because the wings were too thin to house traditional gear, Boeing went with a tandem setup. One set of wheels near the nose and one near the tail, both mounted in the fuselage. For balance on the ground, small outrigger wheels were tucked into the inner engine pods. But this configuration came with a twist. It meant the B-47 sat on the ground, already pitched nose up. Because of this, pilots couldn't rotate on takeoff. Instead, you just pushed the throttles forward, and when you got to flying speed, you'd let the jet lift off on its own. Now, this tandem landing gear design wasn't just unconventional, it was basically unheard of. The closest thing you can think of is gliders, and this feature, along with many other things from the B-47, was of course incorporated into the B-52. Solving the unknowns. But while these innovations pushed the B-47 into a flight regime no bomber had ever touched before, it also brought along a swarm of brand new aerodynamic problems. This was the price of going first. And as the saying goes, experience is a hard teacher. It gives the test before the lesson. One of the worst issues was something called Dutch roll, a weird swaying oscillation that made the plane snake through the air in an unstable side-by-side motion. Traditional controls couldn't fix it. So Boeing invented something totally new, the yaw damper. It was an automatic system that made micro adjustments with the rudder to keep the aircraft stable. That little box of electronics, well, it's become standard on every modern jet airliner. The next challenge was pitch up, where airflow separation near the wingtips caused the nose to rise unpredictably, and aileron reversal, where the wings would flex so much at high speeds that using the ailerons caused the plane to roll the wrong way. The fix? Rows of small triangular blades called vortex generators. These are simple passive vanes mounted along the wing to energize the airflow and prevent stalls. Like the yaw damper, you'll now find vortex generators on airplanes everywhere. The flight that changed everything. After years of groundbreaking development, the payoff came on its maiden flight, 17 December 1947. Exactly 44 years after the Wright brothers' first flight to the day. The test flight was conducted by pilots Robert Robbins and Scott Ulser. A highly experimental design at the time, Robbins was very skeptical and admitted that before his flight he prayed, "Oh God, please get me through the next 2 hours." As soon as his flight was underway, Robbins realized that he had an extraordinary aircraft at the controls. Chuck Yeager also flew the XB-47, and he commented that the aircraft was so clean aerodynamically that he had difficulty landing it on the Edwards Lake bed. After further modifications and flight tests, the B-47 showed the world what it could do. On the morning of 8 February 1949, the XB-47 prototype rocketed across the country from Moses Lake, Washington to Andrews Field, Maryland. It flew 2,289 miles in just 3 hours and 46 minutes, averaging over 607 miles per hour, a blistering pace that was faster than many of the fighters of the time. The B-47's message to the world was clear. The future wasn't coming. It had arrived. That flight sealed the deal. The B-47 wasn't just the best of the proposals, it made its competitors irrelevant overnight. The production contract that followed was massive, and the aircraft it brought into being would have far-reaching changes. Once the B-47 proved it could fly, the stakes got real. No longer just a technological marvel, the Stratojet was now America's frontline weapon in the most dangerous decade of the Cold War. Under the no-nonsense command of General Curtis LeMay, the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, transformed into the most powerful military force ever assembled. And at its core sat the B-47, ready to deliver nuclear fire at a moment's notice. With more than 2,000 B-47s rolling off the assembly lines, by 1958 it equipped 28 bomb wings, making it the undisputed backbone of America's nuclear deterrent. Imagine having 2,000 B-52s today. With its global reach and blistering speed, the B-47 gave the Soviet Union a nightmare scenario. A strike force that was practically impossible to stop. LeMay understood one thing above all. A deterrent only works if the enemy believes you'll use it. So he made sure the Soviets saw exactly what they were up against. SAC staged record-breaking flights, high-visibility missions, and massive exercises meant to flex American muscle across the globe. One of the most jaw-dropping of these was Operation Powerhouse in 1956. When over 1,000 B-47s and KC-97 tankers took to the skies in a choreographed display of overwhelming force. The message to Moscow: if war comes, we're not hesitating. For the three-man crews inside those bombers, that doctrine meant living on a knife's edge. SAC's one-third alert policy meant that a third of the B-47 fleet sat armed and fueled on the flight line 24/7. That means nuclear weapons loaded and crews on constant standby. If the alert siren wailed, they had minutes, not hours, to get airborne before Soviet missiles could hit the base. So, to beat the clock, SAC crews trained in a heart-pounding maneuver called Minimum Interval Takeoff, or MITO. It looked like chaos. Bombers lined up and launched down the runway every 15 seconds, with each aircraft flying straight through the jet blast and thick choking smoke of the one ahead of it. It was dangerous, it was loud, it was spectacular, and it was the price of survival. But as impressive as the high-altitude B-47 looked on paper, that advantage didn't last. By the mid-1950s, Soviet air defenses had caught up. Surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, and faster interceptors made high-level penetration missions suicidal. The altitude sanctuary was gone. SAC had to adapt, and quickly. And the answer was simple, but brutal. Go low. Stratojet crews were retrained to fly nap-of-the-earth missions, screaming just above the terrain to evade radar. These weren't gentle cruising flights. They were teeth-rattling, high-speed runs through the weather and the hills, deep into enemy territory. The tactics evolved fast, and they were bold. One was the pop-up attack, where a B-47 would approach at treetop level, then yank the nose up at the last moment to loft its nuclear weapon toward the target. Even wilder was the low-altitude bombing system, or LABS maneuver, a stunt more fitting for a fighter jet. In this maneuver, the bomber would blast in low, pull into a half loop, and toss the bomb towards the target like a giant supersonic trebuchet. It was aerobatic, it was violent, and, well, it was necessary. But all that stress came with a cost. Remember, the B-47's airframe was built for high altitude and speed. It wasn't designed for the punishment of low-level flight. These new tactics pushed the aircraft and its crews to the breaking point. Fatigue cracks, structural failures, and mechanical strain became the new enemies. Flying the Stratojet was now as much a battle against physics as it was against the Soviets. The mission had changed. The enemy had adapted. and the B-47 just had to keep up. But in doing so, it was entering a danger zone that few aircraft have ever seen, and for many of the brave men flying her, the most dangerous moments still lay ahead. The price of progress, flying the coffin corner. Flying the B-47 wasn't just a job, it was really a test of nerves, precision, and of course, endurance. This wasn't a forgiving warbird like the B-17 or even the B-29. The Stratojet was a different beast entirely that demanded absolute precision from its crews. In fact, it really behaved way more like a fighter plane than a bomber. And because of this, everything had to be flown by the numbers. There was no room for gut instincts or guesswork. For pilots trained on piston engine bombers, transitioning to the B-47 probably felt like learning to fly all over again, with the stakes turned all the way up to 11. In the Stratojet, the smallest mistake, well, that could be your last. In the rarefied air where the B-47 was designed to operate, high-altitude, high-speed bombing runs, pilots entered a deadly sliver of sky known as the coffin corner. It sounds dramatic because it was. Up there, the laws of aerodynamics get razor thin and brutal. You see, at extreme altitudes, two deadly forces start to converge. This happens when the aircraft's stall speed begins to approach its critical Mach number. The gap between too slow and too fast can shrink to just 5 to 10 knots. If you fall below that window, the aircraft could stall and drop like a stone. If you nudge above it, you risk what's known as Mach tuck. This is an abrupt nose-down pitch caused by shock waves forming on the wings. Either way, due to that streamlined shape, recovery was unlikely or at least very difficult. Now, of course, you can watch your airspeed and altitude, but remember, the longer that the bomber flew, the more fuel it burned, and well, the less it weighed. But why does that matter? Well, if pilots weren't paying attention, as the jet got lighter, it would begin to slowly climb. So, while you'd be maintaining a safe airspeed for a certain altitude, that slow, gentle climb could push you into the coffin corner if you weren't paying attention. Now, you might be thinking, well, what about the autopilot? Well, unfortunately, this was the 1950s. The B-47's autopilot just wasn't precise enough to hold that narrow margin. So, pilots had to hand fly it for hours, holding altitude, speed, and heading inside that deadly sliver of performance that punished even the smallest lapse in focus. Quick sidebar, before CRM, when workload could kill, they say regulations and procedures are written in blood. In today's aviation world, pilots train extensively in crew resource management, or CRM. This is a collaborative safety culture where communication, teamwork, and shared decision-making are all essential. But in the B-47 era, well, that concept didn't exist yet. Back then, the cockpit culture was strictly hierarchical. The pilot was the boss, the co-pilot followed orders, and the navigator handled targeting and systems. Input from subordinates was limited, even discouraged in some units. Add to that the intense demands of hand-flying a B-47 at high altitude, or during those MITOs, minimum interval takeoffs, and what you had was a workload nightmare. Remember, pilots weren't just flying the airplane, they were managing engines, monitoring instruments, handling radios, navigating potential emergencies, and try to stay inside an aerodynamic envelope that was barely 10 knots wide at altitude. All without the benefit of modern automation from computers or a support culture that encouraged open communications. In this environment, a momentary distraction or a delay in recognizing a systems issue could easily cascade into disaster, especially when crew members hesitated to speak up. It wasn't until the late 1970s, following disasters like the Tenerife runway collision and the crash of United Flight 173, that the aviation world took a hard look at cockpit culture. In 1979, a NASA workshop formally introduced Cockpit Resource Management, later renamed Crew Resource Management, to combat accidents caused not by mechanical failure, but by breakdowns in team coordination and pilot overload. We also call that task saturation. Today, CRM is a standard worldwide, But back in the B-47's heyday, the human machine was often expected to run at redline, alone and unaided. Now, because of these many factors, its design, its mission, its demands on the pilots, B-47 crews were tested to the very limits of what pilots could endure. In some ways, you could think of this as another contribution that the B-47 made to aviation, even if it was somewhat indirectly. Now, for those B-47 crews, unfortunately, the cost of getting things wrong, well, it showed up in SAC's accident reports. In just 2 years, 1957 and 1958, 49 B-47s crashed, killing 122 aircrew. That's nearly one major accident every 2 weeks in that 2-year period. The Air Force usually chalked it up to pilot error, but that was just the easy answer. The truth ran deeper. The problem wasn't just the pilots or even the aircraft's design. It was really the system. You see, the US Air Force was charging headfirst into the jet age with a World War II mindset. SAC was expanding at lightning speed, with new airframes being developed it seemed every 2 years. And the training pipeline, it just couldn't keep up. Pilots with limited jet time were being thrown into one of the most demanding aircraft ever built, flying around the clock in a high-stress, nuclear readiness posture. It really was the perfect storm. You had a brand new aircraft with brand new flight dynamics, a shrinking pool of experienced instructors, and a culture that hadn't yet caught up with the complexity of jet-powered operations. And unfortunately, it led to many deadly outcomes. But like most hard lessons, it eventually forced a change. The B-47's brutal service record forced the Air Force to modernize its training, safety procedures, and really its entire philosophy of airmanship. The jet age was here, and it demanded a different kind of pilot. Despite the training culture and procedures, we can't completely admonish the B-47 itself. For many crews, one of the most feared scenarios was losing an outboard engine during takeoff. Imagine this, you're accelerating down the runway at full throttle. Suddenly, one of the wingtip engines fails. Now remember, this is in the very early era of jet technology, so it was a lot more common than it is now. The result of that outboard engine failure? A violent roll and yaw that slams the aircraft towards the ground. Your instinct might be to use the ailerons to level the wings, but in the B-47, that could make it worse. Those flexible wings could twist and amplify the roll instead of correcting it. The only way to survive was immediate and correct rudder input. No hesitation, no second guesses. And that was just one of many dangers B-47 crews faced. Some incidents became legends among bomber crews. There's one story of a pilot whose canopy disintegrated at high altitude, blasting him with freezing winds and near impossible noise. He couldn't see and he really couldn't breathe, but somehow the co-pilot in the backseat took over and brought the jet home, earning the unforgettable nickname of the ultimate backseat driver. Then there's the chilling mystery of Ink Spot 59. In 1956, the B-47 vanished over the Mediterranean during a routine mission. It disappeared without a trace. On board were nuclear weapon components, but no wreckage was ever recovered. To this day, its fate remains a Cold War enigma. It really reminds us of how high the stakes were every time one of those bombers left the ground. The Secret War, B-47 overflights. While most B-47s sat poised on alert as Cold War deterrents, a small number of Stratojets were flying straight into the storm. These were known as the B-47s, a high-stakes reconnaissance variant outfitted for a shadow war. Beneath their silver skin, these aircraft weren't hauling bombs. They were packing cameras, sensors, and signal interception gear. Some, like the B-47E, even carried high-resolution photographic equipment. Others, like the B-47H, were designed for a far riskier mission, electronic intelligence or ELINT. These jets weren't just watching from a distance, they were poking the bear. Their job? Fly quote-unquote ferret missions along and sometimes over the Soviet Union, baiting enemy air defenses into action. The idea here was to provoke a response, causing radar systems to light up MiGs to scramble, and air defense networks activating. And while all that happened, the RB-47s were listening, recording, and analyzing, mapping Soviet systems in real time. In some ways, these were the only B-47s to ever experience true combat, and their war was anything but cold. Flying these missions over the Arctic or the Pacific was incredibly dangerous. The Soviets, of course, didn't take kindly to these aerial intrusions, whether they happened in international airspace or not. Over the course of the RB-47 program, at least 5 aircraft were fired upon and 3 were shot down. One incident in particular became infamous. Call sign, the Little Toy Dog. On 1 July 1960, just 2 months after the U-2 spy plane incident that captured worldwide attention, an RB-47H, nicknamed the Little Toy Dog, took off on a mission near the Barents Sea, just off the Soviet Kola Peninsula. The jet, crewed by 6 Air Force officers, was conducting an electronic intelligence sweep, well outside Soviet airspace, according to US accounts. However, that didn't stop the Soviet Air Force. A MiG-19 closed in and without warning opened fire. Cannon shells ripped into the RB-47, and the aircraft spiraled out of control and plunged into the sea. 4 of the 6 crew members were killed: Major William Palm and Captains Oscar Goforth, Dean Phillips, and Eugene Posa. All were in the rear electronic warfare compartment. The co-pilot, Captain Freeman Olmsted, and the navigator, Captain John McCone, ejected and were recovered, but not by a rescue team, but instead by a Soviet fishing trawler. Instead of being treated as military prisoners of war, they were taken to Moscow, locked inside the infamous Lubyanka prison, and interrogated by the KGB. In Soviet eyes, they weren't soldiers, they were spies. What followed was 7 months of psychological pressure, isolation, and relentless questioning. The specter of a show trial, or worse, execution, hung over both men daily. They became political chess pieces caught between the superpowers in a game that had no clear rules. But then, unexpectedly, a shift. In January 1961, just days after John F. Kennedy's inauguration, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered their release in what was branded as a goodwill gesture. But the message was clear: America's reconnaissance war had its limits, and crossing them came at a deadly cost. The Cold War gets hot. While most people remember the bombers and bomber crews, in many ways the reconnaissance crews of the RB-47 flew more dangerous missions and saw more action than their bomber counterparts. The RB-47's missions were flown by uniformed Air Force crews under direct orders, yet they operated in a gray zone, somewhere between diplomacy, espionage, and war. For those brave crew members aboard the RB-47s, the Cold War wasn't about theory or posture. It was about dodging MiGs, flying blind through jamming fields, and hoping the intel was worth the risk. These reconnaissance crews flew without fanfare, often without backup, into the most dangerous airspace on Earth. And they did it knowing full well that if things went wrong, there'd be no medals, no headlines, just silence. Their courage and their losses defined a side of the B-47 story that few ever saw. But it's one that helped keep the Cold War from boiling over. And I'd really like to take a moment to recognize the RB-47 crews and all REC crews who flew dangerous and unglamorous missions. Thank you. The breaking point and the milk bottle fix. Getting back to the B-47's operational service, remember that the B-47 was never meant to fly low and fast through the weeds. Instead, it was designed to slice through that calm stratosphere, where the air was thin and smooth, usually. Its long, flexible wings were optimized for that high-altitude speed and efficiency. Now, that gave it elegance at 40,000 feet. But at 400 feet, well, those same wings became a liability. So, when the mission changed, when Strategic Air Command ordered its sleek high-altitude bomber to go low and get dirty, The airframe entered a regime it was never designed to survive. The violent turbulence of low-level flight combined with those radical maneuvers like pop-up attacks and labs toss bombing began to exact a hidden toll. And well, in the spring of 1958, that toll came due. In a matter of weeks, multiple B-47s broke apart in midair. There were no distress calls, no visible warnings, just clean, catastrophic disintegration. These weren't pilot errors or engine failures. These were structural deaths, the aircraft quite literally tearing itself apart under stress that it was never meant to endure. It appeared that the heart of America's nuclear deterrent had developed a fatal flaw. Enter Project Milk Bottle. Faced with the terrifying possibility that this entire bomber fleet might be unsafe, the Air Force grounded the B-47 fleet and launched an emergency engineering response, known as Project Milk Bottle. Now, the name came from a critical component deep inside the bomber's structure, a large bottle-shaped steel pin that weighed about 25 pounds each. These were responsible for connecting the wings to the fuselage. These milk bottle pins were absorbing far more punishment than expected, and under the brutal vibrating loads of low-altitude flight, well, they were cracking. And if those pins failed, well, the wings just went with them. So naturally, every B-47 in the fleet had to be inspected. Its wing mounts were reinforced, and its longerons, those are the main fuselage support beams, were reworked. In some cases, entire structures were redesigned. To verify the repairs, test airframes were tortured in ground-based rigs, literally bent and flexed thousands of times to simulate years of flight in a matter of weeks. While it was brutal and expensive, it did work. The B-47 fleet was saved, for now. But behind the quick fix was a deeper truth. The old way of designing aircraft was broken. From steel pins to systemic change. For decades, aircraft designers followed a simple formula. Build it strong, test it statically, and add a safety buffer. Now, that approach had worked fine in the propeller era, but jets, especially ones flying extreme profiles like the B-47, well, they introduced new stressors, dynamic loads, vibration harmonics, and fatigue cycles that didn't show up in static testing. In yet another contribution to aviation, the B-47's near-death experience became the wake-up call that changed how aircraft are designed forever. From its ashes rose the Aircraft Structural Integrity Program, or ASIP, a revolutionary new framework that went far beyond steel and rivets. ASIP introduced life cycle tracking, fatigue modeling, stress-specific flight hour logs, and ongoing structural health monitoring. In short, it really treated the aircraft like a living system, not just a machine. Think of it like going to the doctors for a checkup. Now, what began as a desperate repair program to keep a Cold War bomber in the air evolved into a permanent part of U.S. military aviation. Essentially, every Air Force aircraft since, from the F-111 Aardvark to today's F-35 Lightning, has been shaped by ASIP's lessons. Sidebar: rocket-assisted takeoff. When heavily loaded or on short runways, the B-47 sometimes used rocket-assisted takeoff or RATO. These were solid fuel boosters that were mounted near the fuselage and fired alongside the jets, launching the aircraft skyward with explosive force. It was loud, intense, and necessary, giving the Stratojet the extra muscle to get airborne under Cold War conditions. Legacy and conclusion. Nothing lasts forever. And of course, the B-47 Stratojet didn't fly forever. By the early 1960s, its reign as the backbone of Strategic Air Command was nearing its end. So many lessons that were learned on the B-47 were directly applied to the B-52 Stratofortress. With its 8 engines and longer range, the Buff was stepping in to take the crown. And at the same time, a new form of nuclear deterrence was rising. Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, or ICBMs. Always ready, always on alert, and really impossible to intercept in large numbers. By 1966, the last B-47 bombers were retired from SAC service. Now, a few kept flying. They were converted into reconnaissance planes, weather platforms, and test beds for exotic systems. But even those were slowly phased out when the final flight of a B-47 came on 17 June 1986, when a restored B-47E made one last journey to Castle Air Force Base, not as a weapon, but as a museum piece. But here's the twist. The B-47's real legacy ultimately had nothing to do with bombs. The DNA of the jet age. What the Stratojet truly gave the world was a blueprint. Those 35-degree swept wings, those potted engines underneath the wings, and its sleek aerodynamic fuselage. They weren't clever ideas. They become foundational truths about how fast high-flying jets should be built. And it worked so well, it became the standard. Boeing, of course, took the B-47's innovations and baked them into their next project. We've already mentioned the B-52, but those lessons also went into the KC-135 Stratotanker, both of which still fly to this day, some 70 years later. But then the engineers at Boeing, well, they went a step further. In one of the boldest moves in aviation history, Boeing gambled on a civilian prototype, the Model 367-80. It was sleek, swept, and unmistakably descended from the Stratojet. That prototype became the Boeing 707, the aircraft that kicked off the jet age for commercial aviation and made Boeing a household name around the globe. In some ways, you could say that the B-47 was the best R&D investment the US government ever made, because it accidentally helped create the modern jet airliner. A beautiful, dangerous machine. In the end, the Stratojet really is a paradox. It was and is breathtaking to look at, more fighter in appearance than bomber. It was an aircraft that looked fast even when parked. The Stratojet was futuristic, elegant, and deadly, and it stood guard during the Cold War's tensest years, ready to strike with nuclear force. But it was also a harsh teacher, a demanding machine that punished mistakes and exposed weaknesses, both mechanical and human. Hundreds of aircrew paid the ultimate price for pushing this aircraft and its systems to their limits. But I'd like to think that their sacrifice wasn't in vain. It forced the Air Force to evolve, to modernize, to build a culture of safety and systems thinking that still endures. Today, just over 20 of the more than 2,000 B-47s built survive. They're scattered across museum grounds from the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force to the SAC Aerospace Museum. Sadly, none of them fly. Their engines are silent, and those wings, well, they no longer flex. In the end, the B-47 was a jet that didn't just chase the future, it defined it. So maybe the next time you look up in the sky or when you're at the airport, remember that forgotten bomber that all modern airlines share their DNA with, the Stratojet. This is Tog, 7-3, blue skies, tailwinds, and now you know. PilotPhotog.com